He was looking for China. He found the Bahamas. He never admitted the difference. In the entire history of human exploration, across all the centuries of ships and maps and compasses and the specific human hunger to know what lies beyond the visible horizon, no single journey has had more consequences, produced more suffering, generated more wealth, destroyed more civilizations, created more new ones, and changed the trajectory of the human story more completely than a voyage made by a Genos sailor who was wrong about almost everything he thought he knew and right about. The one thing that mattered. The Earth was round. He knew it before he sailed. He was wrong about its size. He was wrong about what lay to the west. He was wrong about where he landed. He was wrong, arguably, about almost every specific thing he believed he had found. And yet the world after him was so completely different from the world before him that historians use his first landfall, October 12, 1492, a beach somewhere in the Bahamas, as one of the most significant dividing lines in the entire chronology of human civilization. Before Columbus. After Columbus. The before and the after are that different. His name, in its modern standardized Spanish form, was Cristobal Colon. He was born Cristoforo Colombo, in Genoa, in what is now northwestern Italy, in approximately 1451. The exact date uncertain, the general period established by the documentary evidence of his later life. Genoa in the mid-15th century was one of the great maritime commercial cities of the Mediterranean world, a republic of merchants and sailors built on the specific combination of navigational skill, commercial aggressiveness, and the willingness to go further and risk more than competitors that had made Italian city-states the dominant commercial force in the medieval Mediterranean. The Genos were everywhere. Their merchants and their banking networks reached from England to the Black Sea. Their sailors knew the Mediterranean from Gibraltar to the Levant, and the specific culture of commercial maritime ambition that Genoa produced was the water in which the young Cristoforo Colombo swam from birth. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a wool weaver, a respectable artisan of the Genos middle class, not wealthy but not poor, a man of some local standing who apparently hoped his eldest son would follow him into the textile trade. Cristoforo showed other interests from an early age: the sea, above everything, and the specific combination of navigation and commerce that the sea represented for someone of his background and his generation. He went to sea young. The sources suggest he was making voyages by his mid-teens, and spent his early adult years accumulating the seamanship and the navigational experience that would eventually make him competent to propose and conduct one of the most audacious voyages in the history of navigation. He was, by every account that survives, a man of extraordinary physical presence, tall, red-haired, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years on the water, and with a quality of personal intensity and absolute conviction that made him simultaneously compelling and exhausting to spend time with. He was also, and this is essential to understanding both his achievement and his failures, a man of enormous ego and enormous sensitivity to slights against that ego, who combined genuine courage and genuine navigational skill with a self-regard so comprehensive that the boundary between confidence and delusion was sometimes genuinely difficult to locate. He settled in Lisbon in the 1470s, Portugal's capital and the center of the most active program of maritime exploration in the 15th century world. The Portuguese had been systematically pushing southward along the African coast since the early decades of the century, under the direction of the royal house that understood better than any other European government of the age the strategic and commercial significance of finding a sea route to the spice markets of Asia. By the time Columbus arrived in Lisbon, the Portuguese had already reached the Gulf of Guinea, had established trading posts on the West African coast, and were systematically extending their knowledge of the Atlantic wind and current systems that would eventually allow Bartholomew Diaz to round the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and Vasco da Gama to reach India in 1498. Columbus absorbed everything. He sailed on Portuguese voyages to the African coast and possibly further. There is a claim, never definitively verified, that he made a voyage to Iceland in 1477 and encountered there the Norse tradition of lands to the west that the Icelanders called Vinland. He married into the Portuguese colonial establishment. His wife Philippa Moniz Perestrello was the daughter of the governor of Porto Santo in the Madeira Island group, and his time in the Atlantic island colonies gave him access to the specific observational knowledge of Atlantic winds and currents and the stories of strange objects, carved wood, unusual plants, bodies of unknown people, that the Atlantic sometimes washed up on the western shores of the Azores and Canaries, suggesting the existence of land somewhere to the west. And he read. He read obsessively and extensively and with the specific quality of someone who is reading not to learn but to find confirmation of what he already believes. Marco Polo's account of the riches of Cathay and Cipangu, China and Japan, fed a hunger for the East that was already formed before he encountered the text. The calculations of the 2nd century geographer Ptolemy, whose geography had been rediscovered and was circulating in Latin translation in the 15th century, gave him a framework for thinking about the size and distribution of the Earth's land masses. The miscalculations of the Florentine physician and geographer Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, who had written a letter arguing that the distance westward from Europe to Asia was navigable, gave him an intellectual authority to cite in support of what he already wanted to believe. The specific error that Columbus made, and that he maintained with absolute conviction until his death, despite accumulating evidence that should have corrected it, was his calculation of the Earth's circumference. He estimated it at approximately 30,000 kilometers. The actual circumference is approximately 40,000 kilometers. He underestimated the size of the Earth by approximately 25%. He also overestimated the eastward extension of the Asian continent, placing Japan significantly further east of China than it actually is and much closer to Europe. The combination of these two errors produced a calculated distance from the Canary Islands to Japan of approximately 4,000 kilometers. The actual distance is approximately 20,000 kilometers, 5 times greater than his estimate, enough to make a provision ship of the 15th century run out of food and water somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with no land in sight. He was, in short, proposing a voyage that would have killed everyone aboard if the American continents had not been in the way. The experts knew this. The commission of Portuguese mathematicians and cartographers who evaluated his proposal for King João II of Portugal in approximately 1484 rejected it. Not because they believed the Earth was flat, as the popular mythology would later claim, but because they correctly calculated that his distance estimates were wrong and that the voyage as proposed was not feasible with the technology available. Columbus had not stumbled upon a piece of ignorance in the academic establishment. He had stumbled upon correct knowledge that inconveniently contradicted his project. He went to Spain. He spent 7 years, from 1485 to 1492, at the courts of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the monarchs whose marriage had united the two most powerful kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula and whose completion of the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian military campaign to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, had just been accomplished with the fall of Granada in January 1492. A Spanish royal commission evaluated his proposal and reached similar conclusions to the Portuguese. His distance estimates were wrong. Columbus was rejected. He was on his way to France, his next destination in the search for a patron willing to fund his project, when the messenger caught up with him on the road south of Granada to tell him that the Queen had changed her mind. The exact reasons for Isabella's reversal remain historically debated. The influence of a court official named Louis de Santangel, who argued that the potential rewards justified the modest investment. The specific moment of flush confidence following the Granada victory. The Queen's personal religious conviction that the project might serve the mission of spreading Christianity, all played roles in a decision that was ultimately made by a monarch acting on political and spiritual instinct, rather than scientific calculation. The fleet he was given was modest by the standards of what was being proposed. 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, the flagship which was actually the largest and the least maneuverable of the 3, a caravel or carrack of approximately 100 tons. Approximately 90 men in total. Provisions for roughly a year. Enough to attempt the crossing, barely enough to survive it if the distances were what Columbus calculated. They sailed from Palos de la Frontera on August 3, 1492. The course took them first to the Canary Islands, the westernmost point of the known Atlantic world, the last reliable watering and provisioning stop, and from there due west on September 6, riding the trade winds that blow consistently westward at the latitudes of the Canaries in a direction that Columbus had correctly identified as the optimal route for a westward crossing. The voyage west was 33 days. 33 days of open ocean with no land in sight, sailing away from everything known toward a destination that the crew had only their captain's word actually existed. The traditional narrative, somewhat romanticized in the retelling, involves a crew on the verge of mutiny, desperate to turn back, held to course only by Columbus's iron will. The contemporary sources are more nuanced. There was genuine anxiety, genuine pressure on Columbus to turn back, genuine moments of near crisis as the days accumulated without landfall. But Columbus also had the specific advantage of a crew of professional sailors who understood the trade winds and who could observe that the wind continued to blow steadily westward, a meteorological fact that was reassuring evidence that they were not sailing off the edge of the world into some windless void. On October 12, 1492, at approximately 2 in the morning, a lookout on the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana saw a white cliff shining in the moonlight and cried out land. Columbus later claimed that he himself had seen a light the previous evening and therefore claimed the reward that had been promised to the first man to sight land. A claim of such breathtaking pettiness that it became one of the most commented upon details in the early history of the encounter. The island where they landed, which Columbus named San Salvador, claiming it for the Spanish crown with the specific ceremony of unfurling banners and planting crosses and reading proclamations to the assembled Taino inhabitants who had no idea what was being proclaimed and no legal framework for understanding why strangers from across the water believed they could own their home, was somewhere in the Bahamas. The exact island is disputed. Watling's Island, now called San Salvador, is the most commonly accepted candidate, but the identification is not universally agreed upon. The Taino people who met him on the beach have been described in Columbus's own journal with the specific dual quality that characterized European perceptions of indigenous Americans throughout the colonial period: innocent and gentle and generous and beautiful, and therefore perfectly suited to slavery and conversion. He wrote, within days of his first encounter with human beings who had never seen a European ship, that they would make good servants and that 50 men could control all of them. He took several Taino people captive to bring back to Spain as specimens. These were not minor details in an otherwise admirable story. They were the foundational logic of everything that followed. Columbus spent 3 months exploring the islands of the Caribbean, Cuba, which he believed was Japan, and Hispaniola, which he believed was the Asian mainland, with the specific quality of someone who is seeing what they expect to see rather than what is actually there. The gold that some of the islanders wore, small ornaments, modest quantities, he interpreted as evidence of the proximity of the great Asian gold markets that Marco Polo had described. The absence of the great cities and the sophisticated civilizations of China and Japan, which could not be explained away no matter how determined the wishful thinking, he attributed to having arrived in a peripheral and underdeveloped part of the Asian world rather than at its center. He returned to Spain in March 1493 with a small amount of gold, several captive Taino people, some unusual plants and animals, and the absolute conviction that he had reached the outer islands of Asia. The reception in Spain was triumphant. Ferdinand and Isabella received him at court, accorded him the titles and the privileges he had been promised, and immediately began the political process of securing their claim to the newly discovered territories against Portuguese competition. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, in which Spain and Portugal divided the entire non-European world between themselves along a line drawn in the Atlantic, with the Pope's blessing, in one of the most extraordinary acts of geopolitical presumption in human history, was the direct diplomatic consequence of Columbus's return. He made 4 voyages in total. The second, in 1493, brought 17 ships and approximately 1,200 men, the beginning of permanent European settlement in the Americas, and established the colony of La Navidad on Hispaniola and then the settlement of La Isabela, the first permanent European town in the Americas. The second voyage was also the beginning of the full horror of what European contact meant for the indigenous Caribbean population: the systematic violence, the enslavement, the forced labor in gold mines, the introduction of European diseases against which the Taino and other Caribbean peoples had no immunity, that killed with a speed and a thoroughness that made the military violence almost redundant. The Taino population of Hispaniola, estimated at perhaps 250,000 at the time of first contact, was effectively extinct within 50 years. Columbus governed the Spanish Caribbean colonies with a brutality and an administrative incompetence that led to his arrest and removal from his governorship in 1500, sent back to Spain in chains by the Royal Commissioner Francisco de Bobadilla, who found the situation in Hispaniola so chaotic and so violent, including violence against Spanish settlers as well as indigenous people, that removing Columbus was the only available administrative solution. The chains were removed before he reached Spain and Ferdinand and Isabella received him again, but they did not restore his governorship and the administrative titles and privileges he had been promised were never fully honored. The third voyage in 1498 had brought him to the mainland of South America for the first time, the coast of what is now Venezuela, where the volume of fresh water flowing from the Orinoco River into the ocean was sufficient to tell any competent navigator that this was a continental landmass rather than an island. Columbus's interpretation was characteristically idiosyncratic. He concluded that he had found the location of the Garden of Eden. Not a new continent. Not an unmapped hemisphere of the world. The Garden of Eden. Specifically, he wrote this in his journal with complete conviction.
The fourth voyage in 1502 took him to Central America, the coast of Honduras and Panama and Costa Rica, where he was tantalizingly close to the Pacific Ocean without knowing it, separated from Vasco Núñez de Balboa's first European sighting of the Pacific by only a few years and a narrow isthmus of land. He was looking for the strait that would take him through to the Indian Ocean and the Asian markets that he still believed were just beyond the next landfall. He found hurricanes and hostile coasts and a shipworm infestation so severe that 2 of his 4 ships had to be abandoned in Jamaica, where he was stranded for a year before rescue arrived. He returned to Spain in 1504. Isabella, his most consistent royal patron, the monarch whose personal backing had made the whole enterprise possible, died the same year. He spent his final 2 years in a combination of genuine physical decline and obsessive legal effort to secure the financial and titular rights that the crown had promised and then progressively withheld. He died in Valladolid on May 20, 1506, not in poverty, as the romantic legend sometimes has it, but certainly not in the possession of the honors and the revenues he believed he had earned. He died, almost certainly, still believing he had reached Asia. The continent that bore someone else's name, Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine merchant and explorer whose letters describing the New World as a genuinely new world rather than an extension of Asia circulated widely in Europe in the early 16th century and whose first name the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller placed on the new landmass in his 1507 world map, was already being transformed by the consequences of Columbus's voyage before his body was cold. The Columbian Exchange, the vast transfer of biological material between the eastern and western hemispheres that Columbus's voyage initiated, was the most consequential ecological event since the end of the last ice age. Maize and potatoes and tomatoes and tobacco and cocoa and countless other American plants moved east, transforming European and Asian agriculture and diet in ways that enabled the population growth of the early modern period. Horses and cattle and pigs and sheep and wheat and smallpox and measles and typhus moved west, transforming, and in many cases devastating, American ecosystems and American populations in ways that made the demographic catastrophe of the indigenous Americas one of the largest in human history. The silver of the Americas, extracted by enslaved indigenous and African labor from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas and 100 other sites, financed the Spanish Empire, transformed European monetary systems, inflated the global economy, funded the Counter-Reformation, and left its mark on every subsequent development in the history of Western civilization. The plantation economy built on enslaved African labor in the Americas, the direct descendant of the labor system Columbus established in Hispaniola within years of his first landing, produced the wealth that funded the Industrial Revolution and the specific racial hierarchies that shaped American and global society for centuries and whose consequences are still visible in the world today. Columbus did not intend any of this. He intended to find a trade route to Asia. He intended to get rich. He intended to prove the calculations that the experts told him were wrong. He was driven by the specific combination of commercial ambition and religious conviction and personal ego that his 15th-century Genos Catholic background had produced, and he pursued that combination with a single-mindedness and a courage that made him genuinely admirable in those specific dimensions while being genuinely terrible in the ways that his encounter with the people he found expressed itself. He was the man who accidentally discovered America. He never knew that is what he had done. He spent 14 years and 4 voyages and every remaining day of his life insisting that it was Asia. The world disagreed, gradually, then overwhelmingly, and named the continents after someone else. The beach where Rodrigo de Triana shouted land is still there. The Bahamas are still beautiful. The consequences of that October morning are still unfolding, still contested, still generating argument and grief and reckoning in every part of the world that the Columbian Exchange connected and in many cases devastated. He was looking for China. The world he found by accident was bigger than China. Bigger than Asia. Bigger than anything he or anyone in 1492 had imagined. The accident changed everything. The man who caused it never understood what he had done. That, perhaps, is the most human thing about him.